Welcome to Uncommons. I'm Nate Erskine-Smith, and on both this episode and our next episode, this comes in two parts. We're focused on the Canadian immigration system. What can and should sustainable and fair immigration look like in this country, especially as it relates to economic immigration? For part one, this episode, I am joined by Professor Mikal Skuterud, and for part two, our next episode, I'm joined, very different perspective, I'm joined by the CEO of the Century Initiative, Lisa Lalande. Now, you should know for this episode, Professor Skuterud, he's a professor of economics at the University of Waterloo. He's an expert in the economics of Canadian immigration, having written a great deal about the subject, and he has been consulted by past immigration ministers and also by the current immigration minister in Mark Miller. He's also been quite critical of the government's immigration policy. I have quoted that criticism, especially of the expansion of the temporary foreign worker program. I quoted Professor Skuterud at committee back in 2022. He has also been quite critical of the Century Initiative. And yet, what I want to leave you with is there's a lot of agreement at the end of the day, even between these two different parties. They agree, as I do, that we needed to massively curtail temporary immigration in many ways, but actually the government has overcorrected in reducing permanent immigration levels more recently. Mikal, Professor Skuterud is how I've described you when I referenced you in Parliament. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Nate.
I came across your work because of my frustrations at the time, where I think it was the spring of 2022, and we were rapidly expanding the temporary foreign worker program, and you were writing critically about it, and that writing really spoke to me, and really around the suppression or the downward trajectory of low-income wages because of the expansion and wide expansion of that program. But you've written about migration much more broadly. You've written about immigration much more broadly and immigration's impact upon our economy more broadly. And let's start with, I want to circle back to it at the end, but just there's an assumption in the Canadian context. I have repeatedly restated this at times, just that immigration is essential to our economic prosperity and economic growth. You would, though, take issue with that, I think, based on your writing and your research. If there has been that consensus, at least in our politics, what is your challenge to that consensus?
I think the challenge is the word necessary implies something. It implies somehow that if you shut down immigration, that the economy somehow falls apart, which I don't think is right. So it's also always about, what does that actually mean, necessary? We often talk about sort of essential workers. I find that an equally unclear definition. I think from the economist's viewpoint, and, everything I say is not just, my own views. There's certainly a large literature on the economics of immigration. And I think the view is quite simply that there is no question that there's economic potential from immigration, that having a country with immigration and a country that does immigration well, and we can talk about what well means, but certainly there is potential to raise sort of the average living standards of a population, to kind of improve an economy through immigration. So, everything else being the same, a country's clearly going to be better off with some immigration than with none. That to me is pretty clear. But to go as far as to say that it's necessary, I'm not quite sure what that means. And I think sometimes it's intended not as a statement of truth, but as a statement of advocacy and pushing an agenda.
And to pull out one piece of that answer, there's some level of immigration, and it depends upon the kind of immigration, I think you would go on to say, in terms of its potential impact upon the economy, positive or negative. But the optimal level of that immigration is up for debate. And you track, and I want to come back to this later, but you track sort of the growth of, just, below 1% of the population to now above 1% of the population, that growth trajectory from 2015 really on. But when it comes to the mix of that immigration, and that's where I want to start, because optimal, sustainable immigration, everyone, I think, wherever we land on the 0.8% or 1.2% or the mix of immigration, I think the general consensus continues to be we want immigration to be sustainable and we want it to be fair. And that speaks to some kind of optimal immigration and obviously humanitarian. Let's bracket for the moment humanitarian considerations and speak specifically to the economic case. When we look at specific programs and temporary immigration, so international students and the temporary foreign worker program specifically, those seem to me to have become and before the government's recent changes, those had become incredibly unsustainable. Would you have shared that view?
So maybe just to be sure, I don't need to get into it now, but as soon as we use the word optimal, an economist sort of pushes back and thinks very clearly that we've got to be really precise. As soon as we have any kind of policy prescription that defines a policy as optimal, it implies that you have an objective in mind. And so unless you're very clear about what that objective is, there isn't really much point in arguing about what's optimal. Okay, so that's the first thing. Okay, so then the second thing, what happened with sort of temporary immigration after the pandemic, there's no question that a huge part of the population growth was on that front. Was it sustainable? What does sustainable mean? There's multiple dimensions in which we could kind of define sustainability, but one, and I think the one actually that worries me the most, which I don't think is the one dimension of sustainability that is usually talked about in the media, is this notion that we are increasingly drawing temporary residents to Canada under what we call a two-step immigration system. So we're pulling people to Canada under the expectation and kind of very often kind of a promise, implicit promise to migrants that this is the pathway to permanent residency status. That the way you become a permanent resident in Canada is you first come here on some kind of a temporary permit. That's very different than the way it's historically been done in Canada. When my family immigrated to Canada, the day we landed at Pearson, we even use this very unusual term called landed immigrants in Canada. That means that you're a PR when you arrive.
Yeah,
we don't do it that way for the most part. People come here in some temporary status. So what that means is you've got to manage. There's a lot going for that two-step system, but you've got to manage it really well. You got to ensure that people have this expectation that they have an expectation they're going to transition to PR. So you got to make sure that the number of people being invited into this kind of first step situation, the state of being an NPR, that's not growing a lot faster than the number of people who can transition to PR. And that's what was happening for a number of years there, Nate, is that population of non-permanent residents growing way faster than what the PR, because we capped the PRs, we always did, that we could transition them. And that's the worry, is now you have a large number of people who are not going to be able to make that transition. And the question is, what happens to them? And I think that's a first-order problem.
Yeah, so I would probably focus on two categories of sustainability. And you've identified one, which is there are many people who are coming here on a temporary status with a view to transition to permanent residency and potentially ultimately citizenship. And being a study permit is one way. A work permit or a temporary foreign work permit is another way, although you've noted in both cases that, you take the TFW program, for example, and you've written that 85% of workers are exempt from labor market tests, and the growth in exempt permits has exceeded the growth in TFWs who transition to PR status. So that's the first order challenge that you're talking about. The second order challenge is on infrastructure, services, housing, healthcare. And if you have a level of immigration that one isn't properly accounted in your levels, which temporary immigration has not been accounted for in the same way as permanent residency has. So you are also going to have a mismatch between the ability to welcome people and integrate people, ensuring that we have a sustainability of services for everyone. And I think those would be the two, when I think of sustainability, would be those two orders when I think, that would explain that concept of sustainability when it comes to immigration.
Agree. Completely agree. That's what economists call, the way economists think about this is that what determines economic growth? I mean, this is a discussion I haven't talked about in any podcasts, or I think it's really important to have this discussion about, when economists talk about economic growth, what do they talk about? It's about the growth rate in GDP per capita, the growth rate of kind of the average size of the pie. That's what economic growth means. It doesn't mean the total size of the economy getting bigger. It's It's the average slice of the pie getting bigger, the growth rate over time. So how does that get bigger? In the most standard model that we teach to our undergraduate students, the growth rate in GDP per capita is essentially driven by one thing: growth rate in capital per worker. What's capital? Capital is all the stuff in the economy that allows us to be productive. It's the machinery and equipment we use, the technology, but it's a lot more than that. It's like the infrastructure, the public transportation systems that get us to work, the healthcare system that keeps us healthy, the houses we can sleep in at night. So when we wake up in the morning, we're well rested. We're not sleeping on the street. We're well rested. We're ready to go to work and be productive. That's all part of the capital. So what you want to make sure is that capital per worker is growing over time. And Canada has an investment problem. So capital's not growing very fast. And that predates the Liberals taking over government in 2015. That's a long-standing issue in Canada, that capital's investment is lackluster. And so the problem then is, well, how do you grow capital per worker? Well, the problem clearly isn't to add more workers, to increase the population. The problem is to address the kind of the numerator in that ratio, capital per worker. And that's what you've talked about. Now, what we've done is we've diluted the capital stock even more by kind of trying to juice the economy with just more labor without really dealing with the underlying issues of underinvestment in Canada.
So it's interesting, and maybe I was going to get there later, but maybe jump there. In a paper on the economics of Canadian immigration, which it might be published sooner than later, but it's quite an interesting deep dive on the economics of all this. And you conclude, along with your co-authors, that your view is that the most reasonable economic objective of Canadian economic class immigration is to boost per capita GDP in the full population, as you've said. What do you make, though? There are, we'll get to sort of aging population and the need to mitigate some of those effects, which is a common argument. But before we even get there, there's a listener and someone who I've gotten to know through politics who posed the Ohtani problem to me, where he says, if the Jays had signed Shohei Ohtani at $60 million, $70 million a year, I mean, we can go into the details of that contract, and there's a bunch of deferral, but assume it's $70 million a year, and there's a major impact. There's going to lift GDP per capita, but bringing that money in and that contract, Shohei's coming, and he's going to lift that average. Versus if you have 1,500 PSWs who come into the system and they might not increase GDP per capita in the same way. It might, in fact, lower GDP per capita. But when you think of the well-being of our society, surely we're better off having 1,500 PSWs to meet that need, that demand, that challenge. You would maybe push back on this, but are we? If we are, if the pre-existing population is not made worse off, and the new incoming population is made better off on their own terms from the situation that they're leaving, aren't we collectively better off?
So, I mean, of course, this is an argument that we address, hit right on the head in the paper itself. It's an issue that, is fundamental to economic theory, what we call welfare economics. The problem is one fundamentally, the problem is one in how do you do welfare economics when the underlying population whose welfare you're measuring is changing? Yeah. The same problem arises actually when you do environmentally. Well, you do optimal environmental policy, because there again, you have to think about welfare in the population, but the population is the population often, the population you care about is a population in the future that doesn't exist yet. And you don't know how big it's going to be. Yeah. Future generations, right? So it's the same issue. Here's my thinking on this, right? So if the point you made is absolutely correct, that if you increase the number of PSWs, you lower the average. You also do another thing: you increase inequality in society. But it's entirely possible that the existing population is better off. because they benefit. It's kind of like this complementarity that they benefit from these PSWs taking care of them.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that argument works a lot better in a country in which immigration works much more like a guest worker program, where the migrants who are coming, those PSWs, are not actually part of the population. They're very much separate from the population. That's not how we do immigration in Canada. New immigrants, new PRs are de facto citizens. It's really awkward to have in the math to have a social welfare function where these new citizens are kept out, right? And it's kind of awkward in the math of when do they become? Do their children become? What about when they've been here 20 years? I'm an immigrant. I'd kind of find that problematic that I wouldn't be part of this social welfare function.
Yeah.
And here's the other problem. Here's the other problem is it also kind of suggest that the optimal policy, this is the way you want to do it. You have these kind of guests that come here to work and they're not sort of part of the social welfare function of the country. Then the optimal policy clearly is to do exactly what you said. Bring in low-skilled immigrants that are going to make the lives of the existing population better off, where the existing population is relatively skilled. So I have people doing everything from washing my car, cleaning my house, shining my shoes, doing all those menial tasks that take me away from my productive tasks that I can really spend time on. So, I'm clearly going to be better off, the existing population better off. But then the question becomes, well, when do I stop? How far do I want to pull on that lever? What's the limit? Because I can assure you there's no limit to how many low-skilled migrants you can get to Canada. If you said to the world, get here, you'll be a PR status on arrival, you could imagine what our immigration rates would look like. And so then what does that world look like? Well, it's a world with two things are true. One, average in the whole population that includes the newcomers is getting poorer and poorer on average. The country is getting poorer and poorer on average. And inequality is rising.
Yeah, so the inequality question
I want to live.
So the inequality question is an interesting one, especially, and in your paper you do talk about generational inequality and it can have long-standing pernicious effects. But in your paper you say there's no reasonable social welfare function. You say, no reasonable social welfare function will imply immigration is socially optimal if it increases inequality in the full population and makes the population poorer on average. But that average still, as you've said, must encompass the new residents. Whereas it does, I think there is a reasonable pushback on using GDP per capita as the be-all end-all if in my real world life, I'm better off. Because, and I wouldn't just say it's low-skill labor. 6 million Canadians don't have access to a family doctor. You could focus on that effort. You could focus on any number of sort of labor challenges we have in different sectors. Healthcare is an obvious one, though. And that would make my life better. And on the flip side, the newcomer's life is better quantifiably from where it was before. And so the metric isn't really assessing that we're all better off. Now, you can bring your inequality argument, but on the we're all better off perspective, we do seem to all be better off in that scenario, and yet GDP per capita isn't capturing that outcome.
But I think that the key is, and the way economists think about GDP per capita growth is, what it allows you is in a country where real GDP per capita is growing over time, you're going to have some flexibility to do redistribution, right? So if you want to introduce programs that redistribute through dental care policies or childcare subsidies, you have that flexibility. People are a hell of a lot more open to redistribution in a country in which the average slice of the pie is getting bigger than one in which it's getting smaller. And so I think that's the key. Now, here's the other piece of this I think is really, really critical to recognize is, of course, GDP per capita is not a be-all and end-all metric of the well-being of a society. Absolutely not. But here's what we get then. If you want to try to achieve everything with immigration, you've got a major problem. This goes back to the first economist to win the Nobel Prize in economics was a guy called Jan Tinbergen, a Dutch guy. And Tinbergen came up with this rule called the Tinbergen rule. And the rule is, and we teach this in economics, is that for every policy objective, you have to have at least one policy instrument. Where you run into trouble is if you have multiple policy objectives, but only one policy lever. And why that's a problem is if you have multiple objectives, like we want to do economic immigration and we want to meet current labor market needs, let's say, and we want to raise the average skill of the population. Those are two objectives, right? But we've only got one lever here, immigration. So we're going to pull on this lever to try and meet current labor market needs, but these are not well-aligned objectives. So every time I improve labor market needs, I actually worsen average skills in the population. And that makes just a mockery of the whole thing, right? And that's what ends up happening. We really need to commit as policymakers to an objective. And GDP per capita is something we can measure well. There's lots of evidence that it's very strongly related with welfare, all kinds of welfare metrics of countries. That's whether you compare across countries over time, but maybe even more importantly, within countries over time. And as I said, a country in which GDP per capita is growing is going to be a country in which you can do a lot more on the redistribution side. It's a hell of a lot easier to do redistribution in a country that's experiencing real economic growth than in a country that's experiencing declining economic growth like we're seeing now.
One could imagine, though, more focused objectives. You're talking about a very high order objective. If my focus is instead on filling labor gaps, including in healthcare, now we saw this with the temporary foreign worker program where businesses said, well, we need to wildly expand this program, and the government listened. And there I was reading your work, and the line that I've quoted in Parliament is, we expect workers to compete for scarce jobs when labor markets are slack. Why don't we expect businesses to compete for scarce workers when markets are tight? And I still believe that expansion drove down wages, displaced, entry-level work, including for young Canadians. And I'm not really sure that we should have just listened to the business community's needs on, maybe they could have invested more in on the productivity side to get more out of workers as opposed to just trying to find cheap labor from overseas. But the core goal could still be, we're going to try and fill gaps in the labor supply, including in healthcare, including in construction, including in areas that are challenging either our ability to grow the economy by building housing or are challenging our wellness because we are unable to deliver the healthcare services for an aging population.
You could do that, but you've got to define an objective. For sure you could do that, but you've got to define the objective, and you got to have a quantitative way to measure success and to track success.
Yes. Yeah. I'm agreed on that.
And undoubtedly, if you choose anything other than maximizing GDP per capita, you're going to compromise. You're not going to do as well as you otherwise could have if you just singularly focused on GDP per capita. You're going to water down the outcome. That's inevitably what happens. We've done exactly what you're suggesting, Nate. We've dismantled our skilled immigration system that was singularly focused on prioritizing the applicants with the highest expected earnings towards a system that's called category-based selection. This was introduced by the Liberals. And there is no question. You can look in the points. You can see what's happening. I'm looking at some data. I'm looking at data. I can see the deterioration in the earnings of new non-permanent residents in Canada successively. What we're seeing now is the lowest earnings of non-permanent residents that we've ever seen. That's what the Labor Force survey data shows. So, I mean, that. But
is that driven by? Is that driven by? When you look at temporary foreign workers, when you look at we massively expanded the ability for international students to work, and it's become almost a workforce project as opposed to a study project. That all seems very problematic to me.
Yeah.
On the flip side, if I've got a targeted program to bring in doctors, if I've got a targeted program to bring in healthcare that would make more logical sense to me.
But Nate, I don't see how that's that's inconsistent with GDP per capita, right? Objective.
Right.
So
right. I got you.
The way that you leverage is that you use the comprehensive ranking system, which is a prediction of future earnings. I can assure you, doctors are going to be at the top of that.
Yeah. That's a fair point on doctors.
That skills trades workers are at the top of the list, right?
Yeah, fair point. Fair
So,
point on that too.
and here's the other thing is if you actually let wages rise for skilled trades workers, they might be, you actually want, where there are genuine shortages, wages are going to rise. That's going to raise their comprehensive ranking system scores. And I wouldn't be surprised if skilled trades workers then are prioritized through that system. But the problem is that they created that CRS, which had a lot going for it. I helped a little bit with consulting on that. Has a lot going for it. But the whole idea when, my recommendation was at that time that labor markets are constantly evolving. And if there's shortages in some sectors, then wages should rise. And the CRS points for those sectors, for those types of occupations should also be allowed to rise. But they never kept it up to date. They created the points grid once and then didn't do anything with it. But it should be something that's constantly evolving.
It is iterative. Yeah,
those CRS points should be static. Yeah.
And you confront this in the paper, but it's worth going through a little bit. So, and then it would be worth spending some time on where the government's landed with all of this and their new targets. I mean, a very strong argument that you'll hear oftentimes made, I'm sure that I have made this as well many times in the course of the last 9 years in politics, that we do have an aging population and we've got to, when you look at the dependency ratios of we're just having a debate right now on should we increase old age security, which seems like another expenditure that is impossible to finance when you consider that those diminishing dependency ratios. But you write in your paper, there may indeed be a short-run demographic dividend to boosting labor force participation rates. But you go on to say, leveraging this demographic dividend to produce ongoing growth would require a Ponzi-type strategy of continually increasing the immigration rate to undo the increasing size of the retirement age population. Is it not possible, though, you look at the waves of birth rates and you look at the baby boomers and then they have children and there's an echo, and is it not possible to level off some of the gaps through immigration?
Yeah. Sure.
So it doesn't have to be a Ponzi scheme.
Sure it is. No, it doesn't have to be. I mean, if you look at the population structure of immigration in recent years, I mean, the fastest part of let's be clear, the fastest part of the Canadian population in terms of the age distribution in recent years is people in their 20s by quite a margin. So to the idea that you can't adjust, you can't augment the age distribution through immigration, that's clearly not right. I think there is some potential, but again, we're trying to achieve a different objective. You could create an objective of immigration where it's just quite simply to ensure it's the dependency ratio. And then when you select migrants, you just pay entirely attention to their age, right? Or at least that's your first order criteria.
Yeah, well, the point system accommodates this. Like the point system squarely gives points based on age.
But that's not arbitrary. Remember, the CRS is a prediction of future expected earnings in Canada. So a younger person will have a longer lifetime. They'll have more earnings in Canada. So that again comes out very nicely from the CRS. That's why we want to prioritize young people, is because we're going to invest in them here, especially if they're international students. We want to accrue that investment for a long time. So we don't want to select people in their 50s and 60s who aren't going to contribute much. You want young people. Ideally, you want, as a famous demographer at McMaster University used to say, you want 15-year-old orphans, because then there's no kind of family class immigrant. Like they're not bringing their parents.
Right. Seems a little callous, but okay, I got you.
Cut that out of your show. But that's the idea for sure. There is something to be said for that.
Yeah, I understand. Taking a pure economics textbook kind of view, how do we maximize the economics of this? The lower age, the higher education, the point system roughly factors a lot of this in. But okay, so there is a way to manage. It doesn't have to be a Ponzi scheme. Because when I was reading your paper, I was like, well, I think there is a way of accommodating this concern about dependency ratios without just having it constantly turn into, we've got to bring in more people,
Sure.
bring in more people. So I want to turn to the current decision of the government to reverse course, I think, frankly. And I have to admit some frustration, because when I looked at it, I looked at the and getting to those questions of sustainability and those core to sort of first order objective and second order objective. I looked at it and I thought, okay, well, you look at the rapid growth in international students, and it seems like everyone is at fault here. You've got Doug Ford that juiced it with a particular specific policy for public-private partnerships. You have a longstanding Harper policy that wasn't designed to have this effect, but ultimately had this effect of encouraging, study permits to become a path to permanent residency, even though they weren't really, a business degree that isn't the most impactful maybe degree on our economy from Conestoga College, or we saw massive expansion of certain programs at certain colleges in a very short period of time, and we all know why, because they had to balance their books, and it is what it is. But that was an obvious challenge, and it seemed very obviously unsustainable. Government takes an approach to slash that. You see temporary foreign work program, they've made some changes. It seems to me they could probably make additional changes to that, and we may not be done with rolling that back, but they at least rolled that back to specifically trying to curtail the low-wage growth category. But then the permanent resident numbers struck me as odd to do such an about-face right away, because you've written about the volatility it's created now and sustainability, and I think you said stability should be the order of the day. But more than that, it's going to have knock-on challenges to backlogs, to processing time. It's going to have knock-on challenges to not just the economic stream, but the humanitarian stream. It's going to put further pressure to select the right people, which is part of the. It's got to be the challenge regardless, but it's going to be an even more. It's going to be the challenge now. But I'm thinking of families are going to come to me in my riding, and they're going to say, we're now waiting an extra amount of, an extra number of months, of years to have family reunification claims processed. There are going to be family sponsorship groups that are going to come and say, we can't even get in the queue now because humanitarian processing has been eliminated. It seems like we've just upended a number of our objectives, not all economic objectives, but a number of our objectives, in order to serve a political goal, obviously, and a political response. But I'm not sure that we wouldn't have met that same political response by curtailing temporary immigration as opposed to really pushing down the numbers on permanent immigration. What was your reaction to all of that? There's my reaction. What was your reaction to the government's decision to reverse course?
Well, I mean, they clearly needed to correct what was happening. There was a need to reverse course, maybe not a 180-degree turn that we saw, but some different direction was needed. I mean, I never know. I'm not in the political world, Nate, so I never know how much I'm supposed to say about these things. But I mean, I was contacted directly by Mark Miller on this, and I said that I mean, the question was, does it make sense to go below to lower the PR targets? And my response was, no, I don't see that that's the right thing to do. The first order priority should be to manage the NPR population. That is exactly. That's just out of control. And part of being able to manage that is giving yourself some room to transition some folks to PR status. If you're going to lower the PR cap significantly, it's going to make that job even harder. And that doesn't make much sense to me. So that was my recommendation. They clearly didn't follow course. But I should mention something else. Like, you kind of set up what happened and how we got ourselves in this mess. I mean, I think there's a little bit of liberal spin too here. I don't, and that's not a criticism of what you said.
Yeah.
I think, very much the liberals need to own this. It was very much a part of their agenda. In 2016, we were contacted. Like, this is very soon after the liberals take power. They're trying to, figure out how we're going to move ahead here. We were contacted, a group of 9 academic economists who study immigration were contacted by John McCallum. And he gave us a list of 6 questions, very specific questions, on a number of issues that I went back and read this report that we wrote for John McCallum a few days ago. And I was blown away by how much they didn't follow the recommendations and how much of the current mess we're in could have been avoided if they had followed the recommendations.
Don't tell me that.
And I'm quite sure that not single successor read. I'm quite sure it's not a successor of John McCallum's. There were three after him, and now there's Mark Miller. I don't think any of them read this. I would be very surprised if any of them read it. And we put a lot of time into it. We met with John McCallum. John McCallum's a former academic economist, so we could speak the same language. He understood it. And the three subsequent, just completely diverted from the recommend. Now, I've provided the report to Mark Miller. I expect he has read this report now. But I think it's really important to recognize that where we make mistakes and to realize these how to avoid the mistakes in the future.
Can I ask?
I have been.
No. Well, so
I've been quite frustrated. Like over the years. Because, there was the way this worked, you mentioned the Century Initiative. The way this worked is like the Century Initiative was essentially, I hate to use the word, but it was two of Canada's richest Canadians putting themselves, putting a lot of their money into a propaganda organization that was trying to shift hearts and minds across the country towards an agenda, a very clearly defined agenda, a very significant population growth agenda. And there was a lot of money. So trying to push against such a narrative is really hard. And what you find very quickly is that story, that idea that you can sort of make everyone better off in a population by just adding more people to the population, like increasing population through immigration, increasing diversity, that this was all going to make us better off. That's a beautiful story, Nate. I would love for that story be true. I could be captured by that story equally myself, except for I've been trained as an economist and I kind of understand it doesn't work that easily, right? So
okay. So
first to question it, and then what you find quickly is that you're like a cold shower, and very quickly people there's a reaction that you're xenophobic or even worse than that. Yeah. And I can give you many stories of being shut down by being invited on podcasts like yours, and then it being buried, right? Literally, I can tell you, a senator who has a podcast like yours. I don't know if she's officially a liberal senator or not, but doing a podcast, preparing slides, preparing a presentation, and it never sees the light of day because they don't like the story. It doesn't align with their agenda. And so when all the policy is moving towards something that's not focused on the truth, but is focused on pushing an agenda and advocacy, I think that's the lesson we got to learn, is we got to be a lot smarter, that we've got to prioritize the truth and evidence over what feels good.
So you've laid out a lot of things there. I'm interested in a couple of them. So one is in relation to how we got here. So I do think there's blame all around. I'm curious, though, when you look at the temporary immigration numbers, for example, I look, and I don't know what those conversations were with John McCallum back in 2016, but when I look at it, I look and say, okay, well, there was an active policy to expand, and you look at the levels targets and the increased focus on expanding the humanitarian class, growing the overall class of permanent residents in general. And we saw that was an active concerted policy of the Liberal government to grow permanent residents. And I don't know how much it was driven by the Century Initiative, but it was driven by things like the dependency ratio and the concern around an aging workforce. It was focused on doing more in the world, and that Canada's back, and the Syrian refugee resettlement, and expanding we're now at 80,000. If you look at the last year's numbers, 80,000 entrants in permanent residency were from the humanitarian class. So there is certain things were driving we're going to grow to 1% or above 1% on the permanent residency targets. The temporary immigration never struck me as part of the plan. And so I think there are three categories that I would pull apart here. One is the international student side of things. I do think blame goes all around. I think most of the blame on the federal side comes from the fact that we didn't act quickly enough, that the problem was glaringly obvious and we should have acted more quickly. But the generator of the problem is, I do think, provincial, in that they froze grant funding for universities and colleges. Universities and colleges, of course, had to adapt to find, and they couldn't get it from domestic students, tuition freezes. They couldn't get it from the from grants, because those grants were declining actually on an inflation adjusted basis in some cases. And so where do they go? They go to international students, and they widely expand that category. Now you saw some colleges and some universities like Algoma University, Conestoga College. We could rhyme off a few that really expanded, and their bottom line is thriving as a result. And so that you would say, I would argue that that's like an abuse of the program, and it's not just to balance their books, it's to grow their books even faster. But regardless, that was really driven by provincial policies, I think, with the acquiescence of the federal government, in part because they were happy to see the cheap labor supply. But I didn't see it as like an active federal policy per se to say we're gonna juice the the international student side of things. Where I do see the federal fault is like the temporary foreign worker program, the federal government owns. Like that is, we listened to business, we acted on that. There are, I think, criticisms with respect to international students, but they're not owned by the federal government entirely. Whereas temporary foreign workers we own, and then there's a knock-on challenge of asylum seekers, which has grown as well as a category significantly. So that I think we do own in some ways. It's just it's not an easy thing to fix, in that it's you have obligations, humanitarian obligations on processing, on making sure there are hearings. And I think there are lifting the Mexican visa requirement is an obvious example. It was reversed because it exploded from 3,000 to 30,000 claims on an annual basis from Mexico. But it's not, as a category, that's just a hard thing for the government to confront. And it's not like they haven't screwed that up like they did with temporary foreign workers. So, I don't know. Before we get to the second part, maybe like you would disagree with that sort of characterization of it, though, probably.
Yes, quite strongly, actually. And I'm a fan, Nate, but I also don't go around. My wife tells me I got a mouth like a ripped pocket. Stuff just falls out of it. So I'll tell you also, this is something I don't often reveal.
I'll tell you what my wife tells us about me, so that's fine.
Is it like I voted very enthusiastically for Trudeau in 2015? This is really not a partisan criticism, but I've been part of this immigration world in Canada for a long time. I was certainly part of discussions when Jason Kenney was the immigration minister. I've watched the transition. I saw sort of a lot of, and I follow it closely. There is just no question that the initial impetus for massively growing the international student program was part of a push from one-step immigration to two-step immigration. John McCallum in 2016 was quoted very clearly that we need to massively ramp up international student entries because these are in his words, ideal immigrants. That's all good. I mean, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying this is the way we saw our solution is that we bring migrants here. They kind of acculturize, they learn the language skills, they get Canadian credentials. So all these credential recognition issues are overcome. We grow. So you look at what the kind of the reports being put out by Global Affairs, all through like going back to like 2008. This is all about how do we massively grow the international student program. This all was part of that.
But pause there, because as soon as the international student population runs away, like it's like impossible to incorporate international students now in our permanent residency numbers because it's run away from, like, was it already running away from it in 2015, 2016?
No. So here's where it runs away, Nate. Here's where it runs away. And this is just poor policy design. Where it runs away is very quickly, policymakers realize if we're going to scale this up, if we're going to increasingly scale up immigration levels to follow to try and reach 100 million by 2100, how are we going to do that? Through this new one-step immigration. We're going to lean on international students, so we need those numbers to increase. How are we going to do that? Well, it's not happening at the universities. Schools like the University of Toronto, UBC, McGill, they're not scaling up. Why? Because they don't have any problems getting international students. Filling seats. They don't have a problem with filling seats. Then if the government comes and says, you got to take more international students, they're like, why do I need to do that? We've got wonderful domestic students. We just pick whoever the best students are. We don't really care. So the margin on which you could scale up international student enrollments wasn't there. So the federal government, before the liberals, this is Jason Kenney, introduced a program that essentially targeted migrants, prospective international students from I think the first country was India. I forget the name of this program. There's so many acronyms that you got to remember. But it was a big program that basically just bypassed all the usual application hurdles for the students that said, here's a very simple way to apply to a college. It was specifically a college program. And it was a collaboration between the federal government and the colleges across the country to target students from India and China, the Philippines, Vietnam. And that's, as soon as you look when that was introduced, you see the college, there's like a discontinuity in the trend. It starts to jump at that point. This is before 2015. So it starts to run away. And so the colleges realize, listen, this is an unbelievable thing that we've got here. We can charge almost any amount of money because the students are well aware that this is their pathway to PR status and that the price they have to pay for that PR status is tuition at some college. And so the colleges, in effect, we've always as a country avoided selling immigration. We could do that. We can auction off PR.
Yeah. But this happened through the college. Yeah, but it happened through the college system.
What happened.
Yeah.
We monetized it through tuition. That's exactly what happened. People are paying 7 times more for up to 7 times more and going to these like really poor quality colleges and through these public partner private.
Yeah, but
the other thing I should say is here.
But before you get there,
thing,
okay, yeah, fire away. Yeah, okay. Fire away.
Sorry, you can see I get a little fired up about these things. The last piece of this is, okay, so now the colleges realize they want to scale up, and they know that the carrot to attracting the students is PR status. That's the carrot. This is your pathway to PR. Now, there's a hurdle, and that is the second gate. The first gate is to get them to the college. The second gate is the federal government controls. That's the PR status. Now, the college students find not that easy to get past that gate because there's a point system that's really rigid and they're not getting enough points. The university grads are out competing them. They're not getting enough points. So now what happens? Now there's a lot of lobbying from the from the colleges. The colleges start lobbying the government to change the rules on PR selection, on the CRS, on the express entry system, to try and to prioritize lower skilled migrants. And so then what you get is a gradual dismantling of the skilled immigration system. You get that through growth in the provincial nominee programs, which have lower standards. It bypasses the federal skilled system. You get that through the new category-based system that now completely does away with the CRS. And what that does is it makes the selection system look like a lottery that now incentivizes these migrants to go to colleges even more because now they see there are actually pathways for them to get PR status. It actually started during the pandemic when the federal government introduced all these ad hoc PR selection programs for essential workers that were essentially just lower skilled migrants. So it's a vicious cycle, and that's how it took off.
Yeah,
got out of control.
But the story you've told there, I think, is still consistent with my view of things. Insofar as, but for some of the comments that you made, where you were sort of reiterating and quoting McCallum, but you've got a pre-existing work to basically say we want to target colleges and expand international students in colleges. That pre-exists 2015, and then you also have, as part of that. And what I referenced, the Harper government basically says there's going to be a postgraduate work permit that you're going to be eligible for if you complete this degree, and that is your pathway to permanent residency. And that wasn't on it was always there, but it then really became part of the monetization regime that you're talking about.
And they become longer. They became 3-year permits, and now everybody was eligible automatically.
Exactly. So so on my telling of it, or my understanding of it, that's the baseline. Then you get the provincial challenges layered on with where they're looking for revenue, and you get Doug Ford in Ontario as an example, which is the worst offender. And in Ontario, they go, oh, well, yeah, Kathleen Wynne was going to cancel this program on the advice of an expert body, but instead we're actually going to juice it and they do this press release and this announcement to say we're going to encourage and incentivize these public-private partnerships, and then the whole thing goes on steroids. You add the pandemic and we lose our minds.
Agreed.
So lots of blame to go around, but I actually think from a federal liberal perspective, the real blame is that we didn't act fast enough. And I'm glad that we're taking action, but the real blame is we didn't act fast enough. Whereas the temporary foreign worker program, I will lay the blame on the feet of the federal government in a much more direct way. Okay, let's get, so I think we're on the same page. We'll quibble with different things, but where there is consensus, at least on my reading and your telling of things, because where I landed is we absolutely needed to correct the unsustainability of temporary immigration numbers. But when I saw the announcement, I thought it was an overcorrection on permanent residency. Okay.
So, but I think for 2 reasons it worries me, and I've been thinking a lot about this over the weekend, and may get myself to write something. But 2 reasons. One is what you said, that I think it's going to make it harder to transition these non-permanent residents to PR status to make that adjustment. I worry a lot about a growing visa overstayer population. I worry a lot about potentially a new government being pushing harder on deportations, and that being politicized. My biggest worry has always been, Nate, public support for immigration. And that being undermined. It worries me a lot that we get something that looks like ICE in Canada, and now we have horror stories of deportations. That is the biggest worry for me. The second worry of why I think they may have overcorrected is, economists, coming back to the issue about tight labor markets, undoubtedly, if there's any expectation of what this is going to do, substantially lower population growth. In fact, population, if they follow these recommendations, would decline. That for sure will tighten labor markets and possibly just completely bring us back to this world where labor markets are just exceptionally tight again, and businesses are screaming bloody murder. What's that going to do? Now that pushes us again in this direction of being completely obsessed with current labor market needs. And what economists want to happen is the market to kind of adjust. And how does that happen? Well, one is more competition for scarce workers, wages increase, fine. The other is, though, we really need lots more technological investment on labor-saving technologies, but those things take time. We need to more training in existing workers, or workers that are typically overlooked in the labor force, like people with disabilities that need extra training to bring them in, right? That's all good stuff, but it takes time. It takes time. And when you go this fast, from 3.2% population growth to minus point, I worry that businesses aren't going to have time to adjust. And so it's the dynamics of it. I don't know if that's going to play out, Nate, but it is a worry I have.
Yeah, and yet it's going to be, I think, have knock-on consequences in a bunch of negative ways, but it will increase GDP per capita. So, okay, my last question is around regularization, because this gets politicized.
Can I come back to that? Because you said that at me, so I got to come back to that. Yeah, so, it's going to increase GDP per capita, but I'll tell you something else it's going to do. There are people who are going to benefit from this, Nate. So the people who are going to benefit are exactly the same people who were struggling over the past 2 or 3 years. People that are in low-income neighborhoods where there are many new immigrants who are struggling to find apartment housing, who are struggling to find low-wage jobs. Those people will benefit from this. The people who are going to struggle are the people who were benefiting a lot over the past few years, businesses that rely on low-wage workers.
Yeah, but we're probably
GDP.
But pulling apart the ideas there, I think curtailing the temporary immigration, even as significant, and bringing the hammer down on that, that will have the consequences that you're talking about in the sense that it will be, already, the government will hold out because of our changes. Rents are coming down, and they'll try and trumpet some of the exactly, like the people who have been struggling because of unsustainable numbers. I'm actually not sure that moving from 500,000 to 390,000 or 380,000 permanent residents is going to have the benefits to vulnerable communities. I don't think that it will have the consequences for businesses. I just think it's going to have, it lacks stability. It adds volatility. It doesn't allow us to incorporate really wicked smart people who are in the temporary stream into the permanent stream, because we're just going to have too much. And that's the part that I just struggle with. But otherwise, I agree on the temporary side. Okay, so my last question is with respect to regularization, because this gets politicized, and you talked about your worry about the politicization of immigration. I actually have no issue with if people are coming on a student visa and they're now claiming asylum, and they've got a poor claim on the face of it. Deportations are necessary. Having said that, there are so many people in this country who have been here for more than 5 years, who are contributing to their communities, to the economy, they have family members, and they have community members and neighbors who will go to bat for them because they're major contributors, but they're so-called undocumented workers, and they are not receiving the same benefits in many cases. They are, in some cases, not paying taxes, and so we are all losing out on those benefits. And I genuinely don't understand why we wouldn't, on the one hand, say, you know what, if people are trying to come outside of the system that we put in place, we need our immigration to be fair. Yeah, we are gonna crack down on that. But where people have been here for a long time, that they've set down roots, they're never gonna get deported. We're all losing out if they're not regularized. And why can't we have that conversation in our politics? It seems like from a business sense, it makes sense. From a compassionate sense, it makes sense. But from a political sense, I lose this argument every time.
Well, I mean, this is the irony of this is the discussion we are now having right here on this particular point is something that is a huge part of U.S. politics and has been for decades. Is whether to introduce amnesty programs to regularize the undocumented population, or what they call the illegal population.
Yeah.
I think it's different. I think in the U.S., mostly people have crossed borders and come without any status. In Canada, they've come with status. And I think maybe here is one area where I'm guilty of being influenced by sort of my anecdotal interactions with international students I teach. I teach 650 students every fall. I talk to a lot of international students. In recent years, mostly from India. Some of them are very high income. The ones who are going into the math programs tend to be high income, but the ones who go into the arts programs where tuition isn't quite as high are not always high income people. And they're often, people whose families have invested in just an unbelievable amount in making this possible for them to send their child to Canada. And very much the hope of PR status is critical. If that option hadn't been there, they would never have come. That's very obvious when you talk to them. And so now, people say, well, they weren't given a guarantee of PR status. No, but there's a hope and a dream there. And, I am sympathetic to the notion that we're changing the rules on them. And in some cases, just being able to financially return home is actually not that easy.
Yeah.
I am sympathetic. Yeah.
The last broad-based regularization program, and it wouldn't be meeting the needs of the students you're talking about, but it would be for people who have been here for 5+ years, have been longtime contributors, are settled in communities, but are undocumented. The last, we have targeted regularization programs, but the last broad-based one was under Pierre Trudeau, some 50 years ago, interestingly enough. So I'll leave you with that.
Yeah.
Thanks for the time. Thanks for the research and writing you're doing. I find it very helpful when I go about doing my own work and relying upon the work of people like you. And so, and for anyone interested, the recent paper on the economics of Canadian immigration is, I wouldn't say I agree with all of it, but it made me a much smarter person. So thank you.
Thanks for having me on, Nate. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for everything. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Uncommons. I hope you appreciated a bit of a deeper dive into immigration policy. I hope you listen to another deeper dive as we're joined for part 2, the next episode, by the CEO of the Century Initiative, Lisa Lalande. As always, leave us a positive review if you like what we're doing. It does help us grow our audience on different platforms. So do leave us that review on your platform of choice. And send me a note if you have suggestions for future guests or topics at info@beynate.ca. And otherwise, until next time.